Well, here we return to 1 Samuel. Last time we left off, it appears that Jonathan got into conflict with his father Saul after disobeying him and eating some honey from a beehive after a battle with the Philistines. But Jonathan did rescue Israel from the Philistines. Now we continue into the reign of Saul, where we see things take a different turn. If you remember, the Lord God told Samuel that Saul would have to be faithful and be a follower of God, and so far he's done things on his own path and for his own glory. And Samuel warned him a few chapters ago that he would be replaced and that his dynasty would not last. So, with that in mind, we continue into chapter 15. I'm reading from the ESV version this time because it's what I have on me. It's also easier to understand. So here we go. Chapter 15, verse 1. And Samuel said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people of Israel. Now therefore listen to the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I have noted what Amalek did to Israel in opposing them on the way when they came up out of Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." Something quickly to note here. So, people might think, why would God command them to do that against Amalek? We should remember that the Canaanites here were horrid, terrible people. They often tried to devote themselves to child sacrifice, as well as devoted themselves to other horrid sins like that. And the Canaanites were considered part giant, which, according to how the story of the Old Testament goes, they had a little bit of Nephilim blood in them, and that means God wanted the Nephilim gone off the face of the earth. So with that in mind, because they are giants, God decided that they needed to be destroyed because they rejected his word. So Saul summoned the people and numbered them in Teliab, 200,000 men on foot and 10,000 men of Judah. Again, another army of 30,000, or 230,000 actually, or 210,000, sorry. Still a pretty big number. I misted my math there for a second. And Saul came to the city of Amalek and lay in wait in the valley. Then Saul said to the Kenites, "Go, depart, go down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them, for you showed kindness to all the people of Israel when you came out of Egypt." So if I remember correctly, the Kenites were a group, I think in the book of Joshua, I might be wrong, I forget, but there was a certain treaty that was given that disobeyed the Lord, and I believe the Kenites were behind that. But Joshua decided to spare a people group when they came with a peace offering, despite how God told them not to, and then God held them to their word. I think it was the Kenites, but I could be wrong. It's been a while. Let me check. Yeah, I think so. Anyways, that's why the Kenites are being spared. So the Kenites departed from among the Amalekites. And Saul defeated the Amalekites from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt. And he took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive and devoted to destruction of all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and oxen and of the fattened calves and the lambs, all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless they devoted to destruction. The word of the Lord came to Samuel. "I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments." And Samuel was angry, and he cried to the Lord all night. And Samuel rose early to meet Saul in the morning. And it was told Samuel, "Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he set up a monument for himself and turned and passed on and went down to Gilgal." And Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, "Blessed be you to the Lord. I performed the commandment of the Lord." And Samuel said, "What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears and lowing of oxen that I hear?" Saul said, Well, they have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best sheep and oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God, and the rest we have devoted to destruction. And Samuel said to Saul, "Stop! I will tell you what the Lord said to me this night. And he said to him, You speak. And Samuel said, Though you are little in your own eyes, are you not the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel. And the Lord sent you on a mission and said, Go devote to the destruction of the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them till they are consumed. Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you pounce on the spoil and do what was evil in the sight of the Lord?" And Saul said to Samuel, "I have obeyed the voice of the Lord. I have gone on the mission of which the Lord sent me. I have brought Agag, the king of Amalek, and I have devoted to the Amalekites to destruction. But the people took the spoils, sheep and oxen, the best of things devoted to destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal." And Samuel said, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than that of the fat of rams. For rebellion is the sin of divination, and presumption is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king." But Saul said to Samuel, "I have sinned. I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord in your words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Now therefore, please pardon my sin and return with me that I may bow before the Lord." And Samuel said to Saul, "I will not return with you, for you rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel." As Samuel turned to go away, Saul seized the shirt of his robe, and it tore. And Samuel said to him, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day, and has given it to a neighbor of yours, who is better than you. And also, the glory of Israel will not lie or have regret, for he is not a man that he should have regret." Then he said, "I have sinned. You honored me now before the elders of my people, before Israel, and return with me, that I may bow before the Lord your God." So Samuel turned back after Saul, and Saul bowed before the Lord. And Samuel said, "Bring here to me Agag, the king of the Amalekites." And Agag came to him cheerfully. Agag said, "Surely the bitterness of the death is past." And Samuel said, "As your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women." And Samuel hacked Agag into pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. Then Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went up to his house in Gibeah of Saul. And Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, But Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord regretted that he made Saul king over Israel. Well, that's a rough passage there. So now, Saul, who was appointed king of Israel, is now denounced by God himself. Saul, of course, trying to grasp onto things, but now that means that the king of Israel is illegitimate, so who will rule? Well, the Lord has someone different in mind. Let's continue on to chapter 16. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn of oil, and go. I will send you to Jesse of the Bethlehemites, for I provided for myself a king among his sons." And Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears, he will kill me." And the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you, and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord, and invite Jesse to sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do, and you shall anoint for me him whom I declare to you." Samuel did what the Lord commanded him and came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to meet him, trembling, and said, "Do you come peacefully?" And he said, "Peaceably. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves, and come with me to sacrifice." And he consecrated Jesse and his sons, and invited them to sacrifice. When he came, he looked on Eliab, and thought, Surely this is the Lord anointed before him, Eliab being the oldest son of Jesse. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." Then Jesse said to Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel, and he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Then Jesse made Shammah, third oldest, pass by, and he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." And Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen these." Then Samuel said to Jesse, "Are all your sons here?" And he said, "There remains yet the youngest, but behold, he's keeping the sheep." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Send him and get him, for we will not sit down until he comes here." And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, and had beautiful eyes, and was handsome. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. And Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. Oh boy. So, Saul has been rejected. And now God chooses a lowly shepherd from the small town of Bethlehem, of the tribe of Judah. So, God chooses this young fella David. Let's see how good he is. Will he be of worth to God? Will he serve him righteously? We shall see. Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit from the Lord tormented him. Now there's a lot of theories on this part. I like to think that Saul was being tormented by a demon, but there's also the fact that it's a harmful spirit from the Lord, and God does not control demons. So I've heard other things like just an angel was tormenting him, or some people think he had a mental illness, or other things like that. And Saul's servants said to him, "Behold now, a harmful spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord now command your servants who are before you to seek out a man who is skilled in playing the lyre. And when the harmful spirit from God is upon you, he will play, and you will be well." So Saul said to his servants, "Provide for me a man who can play well, and bring him to me." One of the young men answered, "Behold, I have seen the son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a man of good presence, and the Lord is with him." Therefore Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me David your son, who is with the sheep." And Jesse took a donkey laden with bread and a skin of the wine, and the young goat, and sent them by David his son to Saul. And David came to Saul and entered his service. And Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor-bearer. And Saul said to Jesse, saying, "Let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight." And whenever the harmful spirit from God was upon Saul, David took the lyre and played it in with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the harmful spirit departed from him. End of chapter 16. So already we see that Saul has been tormented by a spirit from God, which makes me think it's actually not a demon. I've heard that interpretation a long time, but I don't think it's a demon, in my opinion. I think it's some sort of angelic spirit or something like that. Angelic being tormenting Saul. Because remember, God did not want Saul as king of Israel. He was angry at him. And Saul is becoming tormented now. But he also sends David to alleviate him, because I think God's a God of mercy. So let's continue. We go to chapter 17. I think we've all heard this story before, but I'm going to read it anyways. It's quite a long chapter, but I think it's worth it. So this will be a longer episode. And I think it's worth it because we need to see just how David's story has begun here, and I think this is his most important story, at least in the book of Samuel, and I think it'd be a pain just to end it right here. There's a lot to talk about, though, but I'm going to begin it anyways. We're all familiar with it. David versus Goliath. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at the south, or Soko, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soko and Azekah, in Ephes and Damimim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and up in the line of battle against Philistines. Oh boy, they're back. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, in the valley between them. And there came out of camp from the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Now, a cubit's about 18 inches. So this man was about 7 to 8 feet tall. And back then, humans were a lot shorter, so he may have been 7 to 8 feet tall, but back then a lot of the people were about 5'5" in average height, or even shorter. So he's a really friggin' tall dude for back then. Heck, he'd be a tall dude now. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear had weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield-bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you not come out to draw up the battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you will be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we may fight together." When Saul and all of Israel heard this, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David, the son of the Ephraimite of Bethlehem in Judah, named Jesse, who had 8 sons. Oh, sorry, I just read that bit. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul into battle. The names of his 3 sons who went to battle were Eliab, the firstborn, the next to him Abinadab, and the third, Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul. David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistines came forward and took his stand, morning and evening. And Jesse said to David his son, "Take you of your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp of your brothers. Oh, and take these 10 cheeses to the commander of 1,000. See if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them." Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel in the battle of Elah, fighting the Philistines. And David arose early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper, and took the provisions, and went, as Jesse had commanded them. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to battle, to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked to them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And David heard them. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who's come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches. He will even give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel." And David said to the man who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine, and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should go and defy the armies of the living God?" And the people answered him in the same way, "So shall it be done to this man who kills him." Now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the man, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. He said, "Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil in your heart, we've come down to see the battle. And David said, What have I done now? Was it not but a word? And he turned away from him toward another, and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. And the words that David spoke were heard. They repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight the Philistine. And Saul said to David, You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear, they took a lamb from the flock, I went after him, and struck him, and delivered him out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said to David, All right, go, and the Lord be with you. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a cloth of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor. And he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I can't go in these, for I have not tested them. So David put them on. And he took a staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in the shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. And the Philistine moved forward near to David, and his shield-bearer went in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him. He was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. The Philistine said to David, Am I a dog, that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. And David said to the Philistine, You come at me with a sword and a spear and a javelin. But I come in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword or spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. And the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David. David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet with the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag, and took out a stone, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran over and stood over the Philistine, and took his sword, and drew it out of the sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout, and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath, where Goliath was from, and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Shaaraim, as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. As soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, As your soul lives, O king, I don't know. And the king said, Inquire whose son the boy is. And as soon as David returned from striking down the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, Whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. And that's where I'm going to end for today. Interesting story, isn't it? Saul goes from being denounced, and immediately God shows who his true champion over Israel is. Saul, who was always cowardly and afraid, and though he tried to follow the law of God, always took it too far into his own hands. Always was someone who always seemed to have a fake sense of it. And so God chooses a new champion, someone who will praise his name, and does not use armor or weaponry or depends on his own strength like Saul did. Instead, David goes as Jonathan once did. He goes and fights a great enemy with his faith alone. He was under-equipped. He was smaller. Definitely could not have fought Goliath with his own prowess. But he outsmarted him, and he used the Lord of Hosts on his side to vanquish him. In some ways, I think David knew what he was doing. He saw probably a flaw in Goliath's armor, and he realized, I could just shot him with a sling. But at the same time, we also know that David was the underdog in this story. He did not have the physical prowess, though he did fight lions and bears. But he also implies that it was God's strength that saved him those days. And it's why we have to rely on God's strength ourselves. Truly, we don't really have much power on our own. We have to rely on the Lord of Hosts often. And which is what David did. He was not afraid. Never was. But I will say with this about him. Though he wasn't afraid, he's still human, still fallible. We see almost a small sense of arrogance in David's voice. Not a bad sense of arrogance, more like he knew what he was getting into. He was confident, brave, chivalrous, willing to take on any enemy he saw because he knew God was his hero, that God would deliver him. And in my opinion, the story shows that David was the true king of the Israelites this day. Saul cowered in his tent, while a true leader, a true king of these people, went out and fought a great enemy. And that's how God is showing the Israelites who a true leader is, someone who's not afraid to stand up to a bully or things like that. Think about that when it comes to the way we choose our leaders. Should we have a leader who's afraid to go out and fight? Someone who just doesn't want to deal with his problems? Someone who blames problems on other people? Or should we have a leader who's willing to sacrifice themselves for us? Willing to go out and face odds that frankly would probably kill them? I think we should know what the true leader is. Someone who would put himself before the people in a good way, not in a selfish way, but put himself before the people as their champion and face evil that could potentially kill them. Because that's what true leadership is. A leader does not follow. The leader supports the others. And David brought the morale back up of the Israelites there with the killing of Goliath. They were afraid of the huge man. I would be. They thought he would probably kill them all. But David wasn't afraid. And once he showed the Israelites that Goliath was only a man that could be killed, they chased the Philistines and defeated them. So, I think we know who the true king of Israel is now, especially after Samuel anointed him. But we'll see how this story goes, especially when Saul continues to be hounded by that vile spirit. May the Lord be with you and bless your day.